Welcome to Syria Alternative Dialogues, a podcast that provides a platform for knowledge production and evidence-based dialogues about domestic and transitional political, economic, and social challenges in Syria's protracted conflict, produced by the Syrian Center for Policy Research in partnership with the Arab Studies Institute and Security in Context.
My name is Bassam Haddad, and I'm joined today by Rabie Nasser and our remarkable guest, Marwa Daoudy, Professor Daoudy. We are today holding the first official podcast of the new podcast, Syria Alternative Dialogues, Syria, حوارات بديلة. And we are fortunate to have with us Professor Daoudy, whom I'll introduce in just a minute, addressing the Syrian conflict and all sorts of topics dealing with climate change and beyond. But first, I would like to introduce my partner in crime, Rabie Nasser, who heads the Syrian Center for Policy Research, and perhaps share that our third partner, who runs Security in Context, Omar Dahi, is part of this podcast, part of the co-sponsorship, as well as the Arab Studies Institute, where I am affiliated. Rabie, if you can share a couple words about the podcast before we introduce Dr. Daoudy.
Thank you, Bassam. I'm honored to join you and Marwa on this first episode. And this podcast is a product of long preparation and discussions between the three institutions. And we invest a lot of time and effort to make it relevant to Syria, to read critically the knowledge production about Syria and develop the policy-oriented research related to Syria, to make it more homegrown, to make it more critical in reading the mainstream research and the production of different institutions, to make the discussion about Syria relevant to evidence, but also independent from the donors and from the political hegemony. So we have this big vision, but also we start in these small steps, and we hope to join by different institutions and partners in this journey to develop the concept about diagnosing such a complicated conflict as in Syria. Back to you, Bassam.
Thank you, Rabie. وأهلا وسهلا مروة.
أهلا فيكم. I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to your first. Being the first guest is an honor, really. And Rabie, you said all the words I like: Syria, independence, anti-hegemony, critical thinking, knowledge production. So I'm all in and thrilled to be here with you today.
Same here. We're very excited. I will introduce you formally, although your bio doesn't do justice to all the things you are doing and you have done. But we are excited to be joined by Dr. Marwa Daoudy, who is an associate professor of international relations at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and the Saif Ghubash Chair in Arab Studies at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Prior to Georgetown University, Dr. Daoudy was a lecturer at Oxford University in the UK in the Department of Politics and International Relations, a fellow of Oxford's Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College, and a visiting scholar at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson's School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Daoudy's second book on the origin of the Syrian conflict, Climate Change and Human Security, out of Cambridge in 2020, won the 2020 Harold and Margaret Sprout Prize by the International Studies Association, awarded for the best books in the field of environmental studies. So we are lucky to have Marwa join us and address the very important and thorny topics related to the Syrian conflict, and has quite a bit to share. Marwa, we are talking about this book, of course, 2 years after publication, but is relevant as ever. And I understand from the various topics in the book that it addresses a number of topics beyond what the title suggests, which is an issue that you might want to address, because there's been some confusion regarding the title because it circumscribes the book a bit more than you probably intended. In all cases, would you please share with us, in any detail you feel appropriate, the main arguments of the book and how it helps us understand the situation in Syria, not least going forward?
So this book came out as a native Syrian scholar, as a Syrian myself, but also as a scholar of environmental security, international relations, and Middle East politics. I started witnessing an ongoing debate, a narrative about the conflict in Syria being climate-induced, and I have been doing extensive field research in Syria. My first book was about the transboundary water relations between Syria, Turkey, and Iraq from a power asymmetry perspective, and had access to a lot of data. And I felt this conversation happening in the US and Europe, and Syrians were absent of that conversation. primary sources were absent, and people were just sort of like, developing this narrative, this nexus that climate change, scarcity, water scarcity, and drought lead to conflict, hence the Syrian conflict. And this, for me, robbed the Syrians from their agency. The revolutionaries, because we had a revolution in Syria, which meant and still means a lot to people. It denied the agency of the revolutionaries. It also exonerated the government from its responsibilities in mismanaging the impacts of the drought, of the climate change, but also in exercising political repression when the Syrian revolution started. And then it escalated, as we all know, into a very dramatic conflict. So like many Syrians, I was thrilled, overwhelmed, and then later on devastated by the impacts of the conflict. So I thought I would write that book to debunk that thesis that were happening outside of Syria. And the title is misleading, as you say, Bassam, because I don't get, writers, we don't always choose the title, the publisher does. And unfortunately, if people just, stop at read the title, they don't get what the book is about. What I wanted was to bring also a focus on what happened the decades before the conflict, before the revolution, from a climate change, environmental politics, societal perspective, looking at the impacts of scarcity, water scarcity, the development of the agricultural sector, and so the role played by ideologies and policies, the political economy of it all, what I coined as the structural factors behind the vulnerabilities of the people and mainly the rural communities in Syria, which led to their displacement in 2006, 2010, actually, during the very severe drought that happened. But they were not the ones behind the revolution. They were displaced. They went to major urban centers. They were put in slums. They were completely neglected by the government. And there were much more to say about Syria in the decades that preceded. And I developed a framework which I call human, environmental, climate security, where I look at all levels of vulnerabilities, including environmental vulnerability. But my main thesis was that it's the political economy, it's the policy behind it, and it's the role of the government that mattered. So I'm into the history of Syria's agricultural policies, water policies, the interaction with issues of citizenship, the issue of food security and insecurity, the failures of these policies, and how the shift to neoliberal reforms have also completely abandoned those rural communities at a very dire time, which was the time of high drought because of climate change. So what I'm saying, climate change matters, but it's very political, and the management or the mismanagement mattered as well.
Rabie, would you like to field the next question?
Yes, I think this is very interesting, Marwa, because it's part of this discussion to make this link between political, social, environment discussion. And what we try to clarify through different attempts to see where is the oppression played role as a core, as you said, structural factor in reaching this point to this catastrophic conflict. But from a climate point of view, where do you see the under-researched impact of the conflict on the environmental, first, resources, and second, pollution? As you know that the extreme use of weapons, the lack of governance, the destruction of the basic institutions, and also the increase of conflict economy and pillage, which abuse the resources and increase the pollution. Where do you see the black spot? Where do you see that we overlooked our understanding of the impact of conflict on the environment during the conflict?
So Rabie, thank you for that question, because there are two sides to the debate, right? There's the idea that climate change is a driver of conflict, which I think could be very deterministic, right? And sort of link would be through water scarcity, drought, and then there's displacement, migration, and then there's instability. The other side of the question, which is very important, is how armed conflicts also impact natural resources and how they deteriorate not only water. We know in Syria, for example, a lot of the aerial bombardments by the Russians, by the regime, by the Americans, and et cetera, have really polluted because you had oil spills into groundwater. There was an issue of quantity, but also of quality. And today, more than half of the population in Syria does not have access to safe water. So this is catastrophic. In addition to that, you have the collapse of the agricultural sector. You have acute food insecurity. I was reading recently that Syria now ranks amongst the 10 most food insecure countries in the world. So that means with the peak of the food prices, the lack of access, the incapacity to grow because of, devastation and bombardments, there is drastic decrease in the production of wheat and production of so-called strategic crops. And also here, again, the mismanagement, very water-consumptive crops such as wheat, cotton, which are heralded as strategic crops for ideological reasons, which in fact end up not being delivered where they were needed. So this is adding also to the environmental degradation. I want to add also something which is understudied, to get back to your question, which is the continued legacy of toxic rubbles. As I was doing research about the impact of the conflict, when you have buildings which are shattered by aerial bombardments, they happen to be industrial, medical buildings, so they carry a lot of toxic material in them. And this toxic material, if it's not cleansed quickly, it becomes a hazard, a public health hazard, and it is killing the population. So the tragedy here is not only when the aerial bombardments stop, which is not the case everywhere in Syria, by the way. We know that the region of Idlib continues to be bombed, but in other areas, you assume finally the bombs have stopped, they continue to kill because of the toxicity of the rubbles. And then again, we have the war profiteers who take contracts to clean those toxic rubbles, end up not doing it despite winning the bids. And so it's an ongoing cycle of devastation, human insecurity, which is happening still more than 10 years after the start of the conflict.
And maybe I will add to this discussion that the primitive oil refineries, for instance, or the pillage of some infrastructure or destroy it, which create a huge impact on the resources and as a pollution, the air pollution, because of shift in using different oil derivatives. For instance, using the wood and using sometimes the plastic to make the heat for the cooking for the households. So we have, as you mentioned, many of the elements that actually we don't know to what extent this destroyed the foundation of the environment, and the most important, destroying the health of people, because also the quality of the food production and the related process like the storage, like the distribution, is deteriorated as well.
If I may add, Rabie, because of the destruction of the oil refineries, you have makeshift refineries which are established by civilians to compensate for this destruction. And they run by civilians who don't have necessarily the expertise, who are exposed to these fumes. And they also run with the help of children. So we have an added layer of human insecurity, which is disheartening because, of course, we know those children should be going to school, but the schools are also destroyed. In addition, they're working in very, very dangerous conditions in those makeshift refineries, which in addition are polluting the environment. So I feel it's an endless cycle of destruction and erosion, actually.
One of these consequences is part of our colleagues' research in the field. They describe the black sheeps. So you see, because of this primitive refineries, you have these clouds which reflected on the agriculture crops and on the sheep as well. They colored black. So just to mention to what extent this affects the people's life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you very much, Marwa, and thanks, Rabie, for this exchange. We have actually a large number of topics to discuss, and one of them has to do with what is going on today more broadly. And I know, Marwa, that you have reservations about people talking about post-conflict because you want to emphasize that we are not in a post-conflict phase. So before asking you to address some of the matters within this realm of post-conflict, which you dispute, can you address why this is a misnomer and how better to see the situation temporally and otherwise in terms of the work you're doing and why this terminology is misleading?
The issue I have with it is that to be in post-conflict, it's not just because ISIS has been defeated, sort of defeated for the Americans, that the situation has been restored in Syria. There is fragmentation. We have violence in the south, and I would say geographical, societal, human, fragmentation everywhere in Syria. So the country is divided amongst different entities. We have acute violence in Dar'a, in Sweda, with like gangs and counter gangs fighting each other, fighting the regime, smuggling of people, drug dealing. The northeast is sort of autonomous, independent, has its own issues vis-a-vis Turkey, who also has boots on the ground. We know the Americans still have boots on the ground. The Russians have military bases. There are pockets of regime-held areas where people are under also repression, political. The detainees have not been released. And areas of Syria keep on being bombed. Until recently, Russia was bombing Idlib and the area around Idlib. So I feel it very hasten to talk about post-conflict when actually we have not looked into the sources of the conflict and we have not tackled what is going on. The violence is still continues to be perpetrated, the insecurity for the civilians. And it's not because ISIS is sort of defeated in the eyes of, I would say, the Western world, that everything has been settled in Syria. So I feel fragmentation is also on the part of the external actors. They don't know how to deal with Syria. So the solution was to depoliticize, to say, well, now let's deal with the humanitarian issue. We have refugees who deserve our attention, and that's rightly so. We need to see the needs of those refugees who are now threatened of being forcibly returned to Syria against their will from Lebanon, from Turkey and other parts. But that's not the only issue. And I feel what is happening in Syria is what happens in Palestine. When you depoliticize, you want to tackle it as a non-conflict, as something which just requires humanitarian deployment or responses by the external, the Western actors, and makes it less scary if you don't have to go into the structural factors and the structural reasons behind what the conflict is about. And so that's why now there's all this discussion about post-conflict rehabilitation. Of course, we need to restore Syria. We need to reconstruct Syria. And all of Syrians are very aware of that and also very concerned that the country has been shattered for, we think, maybe 50 to 100 years. We will need a lot of time at all levels, education-wise, infrastructure, etc., and also reconciliation-wise. And I feel the issue of accountability has been also ignored. The issue of transitional justice is being led by civilians outside of Syria, when actually it should be on top of the agenda today. So I don't like this term of post-conflict. I didn't used to like either the term of civil war, because I think that did not capture what was happening in Syria. It didn't give it credit. So I think we need to be careful about the terms we use, the framing, the jargon, because that also decides about the power relations and the responses to what is still, in my view, an ongoing conflict and tragedy.
Just to capture this point, are you also in favor of critiquing this term because Syrians themselves do not feel that they have passed that point that we call conflict?
They haven't passed it because there is still, bombardments taking place. There are areas which are regime held versus areas which are semi-autonomous. The country is fragmented. The society is fragmented. The people are fragmented. We know everybody in his or her own family have different views on what is happening in Syria. And that creates also conflict within families and networks, etc. So we need to really sort of restore, repair. But to do that, we have to confront what happened in Syria. And I feel now the solution is to just ignore the last 10 years and to move on and to think what is the most urgent need now. We need to possibly tackle the refugees, possibly stabilize the country, because there are talks about stabilization. That's what matters to external actors, which have become internal actors because of their military intervention as well. But I think for Syrians, there's a need to really heal and go back to what happened. And I think for me, what happened in South Africa, the restoration was about dealing with the roots of what shattered the society apart. And we are a society which is shattered, which is divided, which is torn, which is also hurting. And I think there has to be a way of coming back and confronting everything that happened. I don't believe in, just swaying things under the carpet and moving on for the sake of, convenience or facility.
Speaking about moving on, before I turn it back to Rabie, can you share with us what you think about the many impacts of the Ukraine war or the invasion of Ukraine on the issues related to your book topics and or conflict, resources, food insecurity, border control, and how these might have exacerbated whatever one needs to look forward to in Syria?
Of course, we've seen the similarities of the bombardments, the Russian bombardments in Ukraine are the same as what happened in Syria, the devastation of Aleppo, the northeast, etc. There's also weaponization of the resources or the infrastructures, which is also happening during the Ukraine war, which was a dominant feature during the arms conflict. The targeting of dams, the targeting of water pipelines, oil pipelines, the pollution of groundwater, all of these aspects are a result of this war, but they also channeled purposefully by Russia, sometimes by the Ukrainian government as well, to put pressure on Russia. And that happened also in Syria, unfortunately. And we talked about the lingering, effects of these actions. I think in terms of food insecurity, of course, there are talks now about Ukraine and Russia being the producers of 25% of the global wheat production. And the forecast is that populations in the Middle East and Africa will be facing famines in the near future. And for me, this just tells you food security is not a question, or insecurity and famine is not a question of lack of supply or scarcity of the food resources. It's a problem of distribution. It's a problem of entitlements, because we're not talking about famines happening in Europe or the US. Why is it always the most vulnerable ones who are forecasted to be hungry when there's war? And there's been titles recently about the wheat war, the grain war, the forthcoming food war, etc. And again, this is a question of structures, inequitable distribution structures, which show that as soon as there's a war in Europe, this has very severe impacts for the poorest, for the most vulnerable ones around the world. Something else which I find very striking is the securitization we discussed about climate change, drought, migration, and instability. In the case of the Ukraine war, there have been a lot of migrants coming to Europe from Ukraine. But of course, the discussion, the narrative, the debate was very different. The discussion here was very striking to me, that the discussion evolved around the fact that these migrants were acceptable, were civilized, were blonde and blue-eyed. And so the hierarchical, the racialized patterns that really come with the concept of border, what it means to have a border. And we're talking not only about Europe and Syrians coming to Europe, Somalis, Mauritanians, Iraqis. It's also about Latin Americans coming to the US, this concept of walls. We're talking also about, for example, I'm in Spain now. The border between Spain and Morocco has been traditionally very securitized, very racialized as well. And so these exclusionary mechanisms were very revealed, were very apparent in the recent crisis. We all knew as Syrians that there was a racial issue. There was the idea that those migrants are potential security threats. But it became even more obvious with the Ukraine war, when suddenly all of the commentators were saying these are acceptable migrants or refugees, and the far-right parties were even welcoming them in Europe because they were so-called blonde, blue-eyed, civilized, etc. So I think there's a whole reflection to have here, which is very important, I think, to think about the future. How do we think about borders? How do we think about conflict, post-conflict, migration, and also security for the vulnerable ones?
You just said post-conflict.
When we reach that stage.
I'm just joking.
I'm hoping we'll reach it. That's not.
أكيد لا, I know. Rabie, would you like to address any questions?
Yeah, actually, very interesting ideas. I have a few relevant questions and issues to raise. But I will start with, since you raised the idea that we are not in post-conflict situation, actually, the key actors announced their strategies, which is based on military security strategies. So they are not announcing that they are reaching a settlement or stabilization or ending of the conflict, even as an artificial way of having a settlement. So we are, even by the strategies of the key actors, we are in the middle of the conflict. And you can see every day that we have a new event that could change the whole situation in many areas, as we can see in the north by the Turks, and even now from the south border by the Jordanian. So we have a dynamic conflict. And more than that, as you mentioned, the foundation of the conflict increased, aggravated. So we are potentially having in-depth more escalation in the future. But in this regard, and since you mentioned the securitization, I would like to see what we look at as an actors who support the democratic change, or as you mentioned in your intervention about the political solution. So the actors who support from a humanitarian point of view, how you see this affect the sustainability, the food security in Syria, how you see the relation between key donors, actors who are supporting humanitarians, including the UN, and their relation with local communities and the civil society. How this make things better toward sustainability, toward inclusive food security, or in the other way?
To your first point, Rabie, I think maybe we're in a situation of permanent conflict in the end, or sort of permanent status quo, unfinished conflict. And this is bringing a new dynamic, right? And I think it's not the first time that we see that happening. I mean, Afghanistan has been in permanent conflict since more than 3 decades because of foreign intervention, because of fragmentation, occupation, etc. And we're heading towards that. And you're saying this is serving everyone's interest to freeze, to contain the gains, the strategic spheres somehow, and maintain each other's advantage and have sort of a status quo, which is to their advantage. Now, I think, of course, the empowerment of the civil society is crucial. And we've seen that Syrians are resilient. And despite the conflict, despite the horrors of the war, they survive. They manage to find ways. And you talked about the biofuels before. That was the way to survive, right? In the context of devastation and destruction. I do believe in the role of civil society. My concern with the humanitarian responses, international humanitarian responses, is that they make the perpetrators of the horrors more resilient. They don't make the civilians or the vulnerable ones more resilient. We have the war profiteers now, who are the between quote unquote war profiteers as well, who gain those contracts. I don't know how we can counter that, because there's a power dynamic that goes beyond the power of civilians. But of course, there are very, very brave and wonderful and resilient civil society organizations and local communities which are striving and surviving, and they should be empowered. The problem is these international agencies who provide humanitarian responses, they have to go through the regime, through the government. So in the end, possibly the aid is not going where it's supposed to go. I'm thinking that there should be ways to counter that, possibly to find ways to reach those civil society partners more effectively and to rely on local means, as you said, versus centralized or regionalized or international means.
Many of the affected population, they are part of the dynamic of conflict economy, or they are sieged by different institutional arrangements that based on subordination and hegemony. First, where do you see the space for the population, the society, or the civil society organizations to contribute in the food security sphere or in the sustainability sphere? And how do you see people start to think in terms of the conflict that sustainability is not our top priority? How we can see a shift or change in this reflection to the war by the damaged or affected population?
It's very hard to think about sustainability when you're trying to survive and feed your family, etc. You're thinking about first needs, right? Survival, food, water, etc. And it's very hard for us sitting outside to give them lessons, right? I feel like it's situations of danger and survival. What I think is lacking is there is no conditionality in all of the humanitarian responses that go to Syria. They're just, sent over. And they're managed by whoever has the means to gather those means and those pledges that are made outside. There should be some monitoring mechanism to make sure that the vulnerable ones are the ones whose needs are met and not, again, the war profiteers, and that it's not also part of bargains and smuggling and all of these issues that are happening now because of the fragmentation, because of the anarchy that is taking place in Syria. I do believe we had a brief conversation before the podcast about this idea of local empowerment, possibly sovereignty, food sovereignty. And I think not only in Syria, in a lot of other countries after COVID, there's a talk about having more independence and relying less on global supply chains, and even more now after the Ukraine war, to see how dependent we are. But at the same time, what's happened so far is unilateral abuse. For example, we all know how the Americans are discussing their free trade agreements with some of the Latin American countries. It's a very unilateral hegemonic relations where they benefit the most. But globalization doesn't have to be like that. We could have some autonomy for the local farmers. And there's a lot of studies in food security, which is to focus on local production, empowering local farmers. And in Syria, we could think about indigenous practices. We have a millennial tradition, agricultural tradition, which is sustainable. which has also adapted to drought. 2006 was not the first severe drought that Syria has encountered. And why was it so bad that time? Because the government intervened. The central government lifted the subsidies at the worst time. So in that sense, I think we can also give credit and power to the local communities if they're not deprived from the means to survive. And I'm afraid with the current context, they are deprived a lot of their means and their capacity to adapt and to survive and to be sustainable as well.
If I follow up on this by another angle, which is most of the proposed policies for food security or for economy in general is around the neoliberal policies. So even if we are thinking of the future, the mainstream that we are facing is one that doesn't care about equality and sustainability. There is the priority of market-oriented policies, and not any market, actually. It's the top elite, and not in the south, it's in the north as well. So we have this evidence and we have this shock for the whole world about the bad reaction to COVID and now to the increasing of prices of oil and food. How we can challenge now even the perspective, how we look differently to our production and to our economy, given that the donors who are supporting this humanitarian or development or resilience initiative or projects are adapting this or putting this in the context of neoliberal policies, how we can see any difference that created from the local community from your point of view. Is there any relation for research production, knowledge production to this? Is it part of helping changing the perspective, or this is just an elite discussion?
No, I don't think it's an elite discussion, Rabie. I think it's very important. And I have an interest since recently into food security issues because I think it touches on a lot of very important societal, but also political and security issues. In my book, I looked at how ideology, and it used to be Baathism, right? This idea of food security being irrigation, intensive irrigation, having subsidies, strategic crops, etc., to empower the farmer was really a major goal of the Baathist regime, and for many years. Then the sudden shift to the liberal, social market economy in 2005, which actually is a shift to liberal policies, right? The lifting of the subsidies and suddenly leaving these farmer communities alone, not being able to, have subsidies on fuel, subsidies on pesticides at the time when they had no access to water to grow their crops was very difficult. So, and that was under the impulse of international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF. Nowadays, all of the elites find an interest in that because we're talking about crony capitalism. And Bassam is our expert here on crony capitalism in Syria. This idea that, of course, you have this new class before the war, they're like profiting from the shift to liberal policies and the privatization of the economy, and also having a monopoly at the same time over a few actors. And then now, after the war, this idea that war profiteers are the ones who are getting contracts, the ones close to the circles of Bashar al-Assad, and also the external powers who came and saved the regime by putting military means, etc. So I think there's a response. A lot of researchers would say focusing on local communities, empowering those local communities, going back to indigenous practices, which are often more viable, more resilient in the face of climate change, and providing them the means to do it. So I don't think it's at this stage, because of the political, geopolitical structural context, it is hard to reach to these communities. But I believe in the power of knowledge transmitted through generations, practice, etc. And in situations of danger and insecurity, communicate very quickly. See hope in that as long as it's not shattered by networks of profit and liberal policies coming from outside and inside as well.
Thank you, Marwa. We can go on for quite a while, and I hesitated to address a number of points that might actually take us on tangents, including the question of how the media, especially in the West, is looking at the Ukraine war, not to take away from the atrocities taking place, but also questions that have to do with the actual nature and developments within the Syrian uprising. So we might have to ask you to come back to continue this discussion. Other topics, unfortunately, which, as we said before the show, are not likely to leave us. Before I let you go, because we promised you 30 to 40 minute conversation, is there anything you'd like to share about the outlook? And I trying not to be negative or pessimistic, what does most of what we have discussed or what you have researched so far and observed, how does it address the future and what should we look out for? And Rabie, please feel free to add to this any specific questions you might have so that we can leave Marwa with a closing statement.
Yeah, I can add one issue. How do you see food security as a theme or topic or introduction to improve the linkages between Syrians or to start a point of rebuilding trust, rebuilding relations?
So first, I want to thank you both, Bassam and Rabie, for keeping the light on Syria. Syria is out of the news. It's a sort of foregone cause. Nobody's talking anymore about Syria. So we need podcasts such as yours. And I'm very happy to be part of that conversation. And I'm very honored to be your first guest, as I said. So I really think we should keep on having this conversation. Unfortunately, it will not end soon because of the situation. I do think that we should not frame what is happening in Syria in humanitarian terms only. It's a political conflict. It's a military conflict. It's a strategic conflict. And it's no surprise that the Western media, I'll just address quickly that point, Bassam, does not deal with it in those terms because it's no longer an issue for the major Western and Russian power in that sense, and even Turkey in that sense, because they all had their share of the pie and they stabilized the issue at the expense of Syrians, of course. And we're talking about Syrians, the civilians, the population. I think food security, we know that Syria used to be a country, a society where people cared about each other. And I still hope that they still care about each other somehow. I remember when I was in Damascus, people would care if people were hungry. And that was not acceptable to have anyone hungry at the time. We're talking before the war, long before the war. And I believe now when we hear about the price of the food basket today for a family, they have to pay 3 times their salary to be able to survive in cities such as Damascus. So they're barely surviving. I believe food security could be a way of bringing a form of solidarity if nothing else does. If the idea of political repression does not, detainees does not, torture, at least food security, making sure that children have food to eat. And we know that many children in the US are food insecure, and even more in the situation of Syria, where you have conflict such as the one we've had and we continue to have. So I believe food security or access to basic needs such as water, food, safe water, good quality food should be a basic pledge for all of the Syrians. And perhaps we can start from there. But again, I don't want to keep it to the humanitarian level only. I think we need to be political and critical and push the boundaries as well to go further and to question also the structural issues and what happened in the last 10 years. I'm counting on you both to continue that conversation as well.
Thank you very much, Marwa. Dr. Daoudy, we're a bit casual in this show, so hopefully people will get used to us calling them by their first name. We are as well excited that you are our first guest because we chose you. And we hope that we continue this conversation under better light, better circumstances and outlooks. Sometimes we struggle to try to look for the glass half full. But like you said, we are going to continue to shed the light on what's happening in Syria so that we don't fall into what happened with Iraq after the 1991 war or after 2003, not directly after, but a few years after it sort of disappeared, at least from the Western media and also from various Arab media. This is another topic that we didn't talk about very much in terms of how Syria or the Ukraine topics addressed in Arab media, because the problems are not confined to Western media with coverage and so on. So with this, I would like to wrap up our first episode with Dr. Marwa Daoudy and thank her for joining us and thank my partner Rabie and Nasser, and hope that you continue following us because there will be a lot more coming up with scholars, activists, artists, novelists, and all sorts of interlocutors that are interested in Syria and the Syrian condition. Shukran jami'an. Rabie, would you have any parting words?
Thank you. I'm very excited about this discussion. Thank you a lot, Marwa. We are honored. And thank you, Bassam.
Shukran.
You are listening to Syria Alternative Dialogues, a collaborative podcast by the Syrian Center for Policy Research in partnership with the Arab Studies Institute and Security in Context.